And good morning, everybody from China. Guest today is Marcus Rubenstein. Marcus is an independent journalist. He's a man of a great skill with the camera, a photojournalist and a photographer. And we're going to talk a little bit towards the end of the show about where Marcus is going next. But right now, let's start with we're going to go into Australian politics to start with. So you're currently working with the Citizens Party, is that right?
Yeah, I'm doing a few things at the moment. Probably one of the more high-profile things, I'm writing for a website called Pearls and Irritations, which is started out as a blog, but it's now very much an independent, what's the word I'm looking at? Independent, influential public policy journal set up by a guy called John Menadue. John was the head of the Prime Minister's department under two prime ministers. He was Australia's ambassador to Japan. He was the chief executive of Qantas while it was under government ownership. So a very long and distinguished career. I'm writing a weekly column for John on Australian media's treatment, or perhaps more accurately, mistreatment of China-related matters and stories. And I'm doing a bit of writing and work with the Australian Citizens Party. I believe the research director, Robbie Barwick, was on your program recently.
Yes, quite often actually, but quite recently, yeah.
So the Citizens Party it's an interesting political party because they don't have any parliamentary representation, but they're very well organised, and it's actually proof that if you do the hard work behind the scenes, and you have a focus on certain issues, and their issues are, greater accountability within the banking sector, greater responsibility for banks to their customers. I mean, if there's only 4 banks in Australia, really, and they're incredibly profitable. The Commonwealth Bank, our biggest bank in terms of its share market listing. If you've got viewers who understand the valuation of companies on the share market, there's something important called the price to earnings ratio. So basically, it's the value of a company versus its total earnings. On a price to earnings ratio, Commonwealth Bank is the most expensive bank stock anywhere in the world. But this is the market power they carry. So this is one of the things the Citizens Party looks at, and in terms of sovereignty, raises really important issues as to whether Australia is outsourcing our foreign policy and outsourcing our defence policy and our national security. And I have for many years argued, yes, we are, and we're outsourcing it to the United States.
It's not just the defense policy either, is it? Because you just mentioned those 4 banks. Who are the major shareholders in them, and therefore the most controlling influence in them is also the United States, who has the most controlling influence over Australia's agriculture, minerals, resources. Basically, it's North America, because Canada's in there too. But effectively, the United States has an incredible amount of control. And John Menadue's often pointed this out. Just for the record, I've noticed that you're quite prolific in, and I didn't realize you had a weekly column there. So you have an agreement to write once a week. I've actually been published, I think, 60 times by John Menadue in Pearls and Irritations. So people who are interested in what I have to say and interested in what you have to say, that's a perfect place to go. I wrote a recent article about Falun Gong on Pearls and Irritations. It got published there. And a couple of days later, Falun Gong themselves, or the Epoch Times, wrote a refute. And I was a bit disappointed that they were going through that transition change of editor. And Aaron had left, and the new lady hadn't quite come in yet. So there was I didn't get any contact to say, what do you make of this? So that was a bit disappointing. But Pearls and Irritations generally are very, very good and very balanced, very stable. They keep out of all the conspiracy theories, and probably one of the you call it a public policy journal. I think that's probably what it is, as opposed to a media outlet. It's probably the most reliable in Australia, I think. Would you agree?
Yeah, look, I would agree. I guess, all journalists are biased, all publications are biased.
Of course.
I guess it's what you back it up with. I had this conversation last night with Michael West, who's a very well-known independent journalist.
He's independent business, yeah.
And Michael was recently sued by a Commonwealth government employee over an article he wrote in 2023. Now, it's a very convoluted case because one of the imputations was that Michael's story made reference to me, and one of their claimed imputations that the references to me in a previous legal case I was involved in were entirely false. And that in and of itself became a mess. But Michael and I had a conversation yesterday, sort of in a follow-up to this thing. And one of the things we discussed is how many stories, as independent journalists, we don't write. Simply, mainstream media finds a story and they make the facts or the suggestions, if you will, if it's a critical story, they come up with imputations to suggest wrongdoing. Whereas independent media, you haven't got that, and it's not just because it's easy to get sued in a country like Australia. It's because you have to maintain, a reputation, and you have to abide by what's there, and I think that's what independent media has become. So yes, are we agenda driven? Yeah, we are, but I think we support it with facts. One of the things I do, if it's there, I compliment media outlets. In my second to last column, I was very complimentary of a piece carried in the Australian Financial Review. One of its finance writers who did an excellent wrap up on the Port of Darwin, which is an issue. The Port of Darwin is operated under a 99-year lease to a Chinese company called Landbridge, and there's been a lot of hysteria surrounding that. And the Financial Review did an excellent story, so kudos to them. As did the Seven Network a few weeks earlier. The Seven Network, which is our neck and neck with the Nine Network as being our biggest national TV commercial broadcaster. They did a sit-down interview with the Chinese ambassador, and excuse me, and I think it was a very dumb news report to come out of it. But Seven, I think, did the right thing, and they actually uploaded to their YouTube channel the entire unedited interview. Now, normally commercial television, they want these interviews, particularly with someone like a Chinese ambassador who the media is generally very antagonistic towards. They want that gotcha moment, and they want to put it there. So, I do try and every week find, mainstream journalists who are doing what I view to be the right thing. But overwhelmingly, it's very negative. They're looking for it's lazy journalism. They're looking for a nasty angle, and I think it just reveals their prejudices and their laziness.
I think it's a great idea what John does. I just put the name up there because if you go looking for pearls and irritations, it can. Where's my banners? Let's just put that back up there. JohnMenadue.com. If you go looking for pearls and irritations, you might have a little trouble finding it, but it's actually John. It's his name because he did, as you say, started as a blog. He's extremely active given his age. He's been around for a long, long time, but I would say his brain his mind is working very, very well. He's a brilliant guy, isn't he?
Yeah, he's always kept his mind very active. I'm based in Sydney, but whenever I go to Canberra, I generally, more often than not, have a coffee or a lunch with John, and it's always great to catch up with him. And he's a great I don't think I'd be betraying our confidences. Apologies, John, if I am. But John was head of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet at the time Gough Whitlam was dismissed. Now that in and of itself is a story, but in a nutshell, in 1975, the Governor General of Australia, who is, in the mechanics of our democracy, the monarch's representative, so back then the Queen and now King Charles. To those who don't know, that the monarch of it, well, King Charles is our head of state. We have a Governor General appointed to be the monarch's representative, but and that representative, a guy called Sir John Kerr, dismissed the Whitlam government. And John, as head of the Prime Minister's Department, knew of this before it became public, and it was made public, obviously, within hours of it happening. But John said to me, that from that point on, he learnt to be deeply suspicious of power and people with power, and that's very much a view that I've adopted. I've seen people with power obviously abuse that power, from minor, petty little things, to be it politicians rorting their expense accounts, or a former politician who I'd worked for more than 30 years ago after I graduated from university. Her career was famously ended when she had a 45-minute car ride to a political fundraiser. Instead, she chose to charter a helicopter and take a 10-minute flight at taxpayer expense.
I remember that.
And it's just this idea that the rules don't apply to them. Obviously, we have a great deal of corruption in Australia. The Labor Party, which is the government currently in power, and for those who don't know, we are in the midst of an election campaign. There's a federal election on the 3rd of May, but they went to the last federal election promising the Australian public that they would set up a national anti-corruption watchdog. Now, every state has its own corruption commission, so they set up a national one, and with the help of the Liberal opposition, they railroaded through Parliament that all its hearings are held in secret. I mean, it's absurd to the extreme.
It's been 3 years in existence and hasn't actually had a conviction yet.
No, there's nothing. And really, I mean, corruption commissions are name and shame things. In the most egregious matters, things get referred to the departments of public prosecutions and to prosecutors. But the reality is, Australia is no different from most countries in the world. There is corruption and there are corrupt politicians. And certainly at a federal level, we notionally have a mechanism to catch them, but it's a mechanism that operates in secret. And so unless it ends up in criminal charges, you'll never know what went on.
Yeah, and they just keep saying there's no evidence to pursue this, or there's not enough evidence to get a prosecution, so everything gets dropped. It's a great way. I remember the TV series Yes Minister and then Yes Prime Minister. they would have inquiries to investigate themselves, and of course the whole idea was just to drag everything on and at the end of it come to no conclusion whatsoever. And there will be another election in 2 weeks' time now, so it'll all change anyway. Let's move on from that into.
I have to jump in. You've brought up Yes Prime Minister, and there was there was a scandal, I think, in the early series, and Nigel Hawthorne, the British, wonderful British actor who played the head of the department, the chief civil servant, Sir Humphrey Appleby. There was a scandal, and he suggested to his then minister, we need to have an inquiry. And the minister had expressed trepidation about it. He goes, "Oh, no, minister, this is government. One never holds an inquiry without knowing the result in advance." And that holds up true. You don't. I mean, there was an inquiry that had zero coverage years ago, and it was not that many years ago, about 3 or 4 years ago, into, I'm not quite sure what the specifics, but it was into into the audit procedures of the big four accounting firms, Price Waterhouse, Ernst & Young, Deloitte, and I always forget the third one, but
KPMG.
And they it was slipped through as a Senate resolution late at night by a Green senator, where they barely had a quorum, and a quorum's the minimum number of people you have to have in the chamber in order to have a vote passed. So they had one or two of those. It was 11 o'clock at night, and the Greens party managed to sneak this through. So the Senate had to start an investigation. So there was an investigation into the four biggest and most powerful audit firms, not only in Australia but in the world. The final report came out. It was 6 pages long, and I think one of the pages was the title page, and I think it was 7 pages. There was of the pages, one of them was the title page, the other one was the contents page, and so it was a setup from the start. They thought, all right, an independent thinking senator has slipped this under the door, and how do we deal with it now that we're all back on deck? Let's just bury it, which they successfully did.
There was probably one of those pages says this page is deliberately left blank. I could never understand that in government documents. There's a page which said this page is deliberately left blank.
I think it has to do with the stitching. If it's a saddle stitch, so if it has folded panels that are stitched with string, or in fact glued together along the spine, they have to be in multiples of usually 8 or 16.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
So you can
ABC
have a
recently. Sorry?
You can have a 64-page book, but you can't have a 65-page book.
Okay. So if you have a 63-page report, you need this page is left blank.
Yeah, you've got a couple of blank pages you have to explain.
There you go. That ask an expert if you want to know the answer. Ask someone who knows. You just recently wrote I thought a very interesting article about something the ABC did. The ABC produced a report. Well, no, in fact, they didn't. The ABC took a report from PBS in the US, doctored it, and then, and then published it in Australia. What were your problems with that?
How long have we got?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, the original program was an hour and 40 minutes long, or an hour and an hour and 50, and the ABC 54. Cut it down to 40. So they cut an hour and 10 minutes out of it. Look, the ABC, our national broadcaster, has become incredibly biased in its reporting, and to be honest, I can't work out why, where these directions are coming from. And one of the things with the ABC, it's a monster with many different heads. It is very well funded. There's, from my limited dealings, and I pitched a documentary to the ABC a number of years ago, and we managed to get over the first few hurdles. And one of the things I learned very quickly, in fact, in our first meeting with the commissioning, the head of commissioning for documentaries, was I thought I'd favourably compare this to some existing ABC programming, to which he took great umbrage. He did, I thought you can't go wrong saying, oh, this is in your wheelhouse because ABC's doing something similar. And he said, don't judge yourself against that program, you won't get far. But they have this anti-China bias. They've politically, they seem to be taking sides. There's a lot more political conservatism in there. There's certainly evidence that they're certainly taking the side of the Conservatives ahead of the Labor Party, which in the context of history perhaps represents balance, because they've generally always been a very a centre-left pro-Labor Party media outlet. But yeah, I don't know where this anti-China bias comes from, but it is definitely there. They are actively looking for stories to attack China. Getting back to this story, it was was a PBS story on the rise of Xi Jinping and the impact on China-Australia relations. Sorry, I beg your pardon. The original one was the impact on China-US relations. So, of course, the ABC, our national broadcaster, couldn't promote it as that because there's no relevance to Australia. So they cut it back. They ran it. It was and their edit was very, very critical of the Chinese government and of Xi Jinping and of his motives. The question is, why would they run it 4 weeks before a federal election campaign, in the midst of an election campaign where China is somewhat of a hot button issue? Why would they paint China as a threat? And both political parties now in this election campaign have tried to position themselves as being tough on China. Of course, the problem they've got now is the Trump tariff war or trade war. And it's not been good for Australia. As with every share market of the world, we had hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars wiped off the value of shares in Australia. And a lot of our national wealth, our personal wealth, is tied up in retirement funds or superannuation, as we call them in Australia, which have a lot of their investments in the share market. So everyone's retirement income took a big hit. So they have to be a little bit careful there. But the ABC runs this anti-China narrative. And why they would run this 5-month-old story in the middle of an election campaign, it seems to me it can be for no other reason that they wanted to inject themselves into the political discourse and bring the issue of China front and center. It's not the job of a media outlet, and it's certainly not the job of a publicly funded media outlet to be setting the political agenda at any time, but certainly not in an election campaign. This wasn't their story. It wasn't their investigation. It wasn't directly relevant to Australia, but they edited it and presented it and timed the broadcast of it in such a way as to make it look as though it was relevant to Australia.
They promoted it that way, very much so too.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the points I made in my criticism of it, which was published at John Menager's site, was that there was no disclosure as to what viewers were about to watch. The promotion, buried in the bottom of their promotions that it was a PBS frontline investigation, but at the top end of it, there was no indication that it was anything other than an ABC program. There was no studio introduction, as Four Corners, the program it was broadcast on, usually does. In fact, always does. They go from the opening credits into the studio presenter, introduces the program for the week and the background to it, and then they go into the story. There was none of that. There were no graphics on the start of the story that explained that it was produced by a foreign broadcaster. And there was no disclosure, which is quite egregious, to the fact that viewers are about to watch a heavily edited program produced by a foreign broadcaster.
It didn't matter what the content was. That information should have been available to them anyway.
Yeah,
but the content is negative towards China. You say you don't know. I had a really interesting interaction about 4 years ago with the ABC. I was not on YouTube at the time, but I was writing and I'd written for quite a lot of Chinese media in those days. I still do write for Chinese media. And I've done this incredible bike ride where I rode from the border of Macau to the border of Kazakhstan all the way across China. And it was ABC Radio did a show about journeys. And one of my friends who listens to ABC here all the time contacted them and said, hey, just as a matter of fact, I've got a friend here who's done this. He didn't talk to me until after he'd done this. And he said, you might want to interview this guy who cycled all the way across China. So I got an email. For me, it was out of the blue about ABC. And I was telling my friend, I got this email from ABC. He said, oh, that's me. I did that. I said, okay, you put me up to the ABC. Why? He said, because your journey was just incredible. And I thought they'd be interested. And they were interested. They wanted to interview me on live radio, not TV, but live radio. And so I wrote back and said, yeah, I'm very keen to do this. It's really interesting for me. I've never been on live TV or live radio in my life. And so about an hour later, I got another message which said, "Thank you very much for your interest, but we're no longer going to interview you. The interview is cancelled." And no explanation as to why. So I wrote them, "What's going on? Why?" And they said it was something to do with me saying something negative about the ABC. What? Didn't say anything negative about the ABC, but maybe I had done in one of my articles. So that was it. I was shot down in flames, and nobody got to hear my story of the ride across China. So that was my experience with the ABC. And their former he's with the BBC now, Stephen McDonnell in China, refers to me as a bike riding bozo. It's because every time he puts something onto X, I correct him and say, "No, that's actually not true." But now he's blocked me. He blocks anybody who disagrees with him effectively. So that's the ABC.
Yeah. Well, when Stephen was at the ABC, I was at SBS, which is the multicultural government-funded broadcaster. And I know, well, it's long ago now, but more than a decade ago, I was in Beijing, and I had a coffee with Stephen, who was quite, what's the word, complimentary, of the idea of Australians going and working for Chinese state television. Now, obviously, there was the issues of censorship and stories you couldn't do. But he said that those aside, it's a very worthwhile experience. And when Stephen went to the BBC, he was replaced by a guy called Bill Birtles, who Bill I find to be a very nasty and mean-spirited individual. And I say nasty because he made a number of very defamatory posts about me, let's say with a very strong suggestion that I was a paid agent of the Chinese Communist Party, who was installed to influence the public narrative in Australia in favour of the Chinese government and the Communist Party. So I think he's an unpalatable character, and he was very nasty in his observations on China and his stories. But the one thing you never heard from Bill Birtles was the fact that he worked for the Xinhua News Agency for 3 years before starting at the ABC. And
I didn't even know that.
Yeah, and so he was happy to take, money and have a cushy job in Beijing, working for it was actually it was for now I forget, they've got a small television outlet, the Xinhua News Agency. He worked for that arm of it, and I believe he worked for that arm, but definitely Chinese state media. And of course, he went over to the ABC, and all of a sudden, the Chinese are bad and they're terrible, and they've done this and they've done that, and it just plays wonderfully into the ABC narrative.
It's interesting that they hate China so much yet live here. Bill doesn't anymore. He left. He left with a very interesting story. He actually got escorted out by the diplomatic mission during. There was an incident where an SBS reporter was arrested in China, and he was going to be interviewed as a result of that arrest. And she was convicted of a crime and then released, which is all kind of history now. And he went to the embassy and said, "The police want to talk to me." And they said, "Okay, we'll get you out of the country." They spirited him out, which struck me as very strange. I'm sure if the police want to talk to me, my Australian consulate in Guangzhou, which is the nearest one, wouldn't bother helping me get out of the country. So it is a very strange way of leaving the country. Him and another guy from the AFR.
You're referring to Chung Lei, not no, she wasn't SBS. She worked for CGTN as a presenter on their business program.
I thought she was working for SBS in Australia.
No.
Okay,
no.
My mistake. I'm sorry.
It was a business reporter. I mean, the allegation was that Chung was engaged in not necessarily spying, but sort of gathering information and giving it to the Australian government. I won't comment on that, although I will say it's rather odd. She now has a job in Australia working for the Murdoch-owned Sky News network, and if you're an international viewer and you think the Fox News network is very heavily biased. Well, the Sky News network, it's got its nose in front in that respect. So, but yeah, so she's there. But one of the things which was eventually reported, but not widely reported, or certainly the story was picked up, but then it was quickly brushed to one side, was that some weeks before these Australian journalists were, and two in particular, Birtles from the ABC and
Smith from AF.
Michael Smith from the Financial Review. Smith, who was actually quite reasonable about the whole process, and Birtles, who was quite hysteric about it. That the ASIO, which is our domestic spy agency, and the Federal Police, which is our FBI, raided the homes of 4 Chinese journalists in Australia, and one of them I knew. And they literally went into his, and I didn't know what went on. He kept not answering my messages, and I just thought, oh well, he's too busy. But as it turns out, he got a knock on the door at 6 a.m. from ASIO and the Federal Police, and they just went through his apartment, took all his devices. I mean, I'm led to believe he literally took the iPad out of the hands of his 8-year-old son or 8-year-old child, wow, and then ran out the door with it. And as the Chinese so often do, you can poke the bear, and you can poke the bear, and you poke it too much, and then comes the payback. So
there's a reaction.
It's always painted as, oh, there's unprovoked actions by China. Well, no, more often than not, a great deal more often than not, they're provoked and they're just reacting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so too. Let's talk about there's 2 events which you've also covered as well. One was the sail past of 3 ships, and they didn't sail anywhere. I saw some incredible photographs which had kind of looked like a crowd of people, and you could see the ships in the distance. But these ships were 250 and 300 kilometers away from Australia. So they were misleading us and deceiving us with their imagery to show that the ships were very close to the shore. They were not close to the shore. They were 300 kilometers away from Australia, but 3 Chinese military ships sailed past. And then a couple of weeks later, they did a live firing, and we can talk about that exercise as well. Then a couple of weeks later, there's this story that you looked at in great depth of the spy ship, which was mapping the bottom of the ocean. And it wasn't exactly what the media were telling us, was it?
No. Going to the 3 Chinese military ships, there were one was a supply ship, so it was just replenishing the supplies of the 2, and one was a frigate. The other one, they were small ships. They weren't massive ships. I think had they sailed into Sydney Harbour, perhaps the water police would have been able to repel them without getting Australian
water cannon instead of guns.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, there was a lot of hysteria surrounding that. It was reported, it was leaked to the media. I suppose the security or apparatus would have told the media that these ships are sailing through. Whether it would have been a leak or probably it would have just been the appropriate thing to do. If you've got ships from another navy sailing close to your waters, well, it's of public interest, so you tell the media. Where it got completely out of hand was the reports on how close it came to Sydney. I'm not sure. I think it might have been 300 or so kilometres outside of our sea boundaries. So the number that pops up in my head is roughly 600 kilometres from mainland Australia.
Right.
Where the media hysteria stepped up was against the backdrop of these ships being here in the first place, was this live fire exercise. Now, on an international radio channel, and for a variety of reasons I won't go into, aviation and shipping operate on radio signals. They don't have satellite phones. They don't have digital broadcasting. So you're not communicating from one vessel to another or flight control with through digital communications. It's through analog radio waves. So the Chinese ship operator broadcast on a national radio network, which was out of the reach of air traffic control in New Zealand and Australia. Nothing at all unusual about that. That they were about to commence a live fire exercise. So the first person to pick up on this was a Virgin Airlines pilot. Now the suggestion was that he was flying around and there was a missile in the sky and he had to avoid the missile, and it was a near miss and it was a disgrace, and it was just broadcast, and he broadcasted it to the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, which put out an alert. Now that was the extent of the message. Now the media suggestion was that the Chinese were firing missiles. Politicians jumped in on it. A number of politicians. They likened it to the tragedy of MH17, which was the Malaysian Airlines Boeing 777, which was shot down over Ukraine by an errant, if we're to believe it, Russian surface-to-air missile. They likened it to that. It was no such thing. And in the end, and this came out in the Channel 7 interview I complimented earlier, was that basically it was artillery fire from the deck of the ship. So basically high caliber guns, and the targets were floating targets. So they were literally firing guns off the deck, and you could if you go searching around YouTube for guns in America, you'll find dozens of YouTubers who are firing exactly the same guns in their backyards in America and posting it on YouTube. There was no risk to domestic aviation, but it was put up as this. And then, of course, there's the act of aggression. Totally, I guess, coincidentally, not long before these ships sailed into Australian waters, the Australian Defence Force put out a media statement that said we as in Australia have been sending aircraft and ships to sail in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits for more than 4 decades.
Mm. So what's the difference? So Australian ships have sailed through the Taiwan Strait. The Taiwan Straits, I think, are 130, 140 kilometers wide.
Yeah,
so
correct.
Even if you were of this opinion that Taiwan is not part of China, even if you were, it doesn't matter. It's not true. But even if you were that, you could not possibly justify sailing through the waters that are only 150 kilometers wide and saying this is not provocative. So what Australia has done has been provocative. What China did do was not provocative. I think it was kind of demonstrative. They were trying to show, yeah, we can do this. You want to do this? We're going to do this. And I think we'll see more of that every time. I think that's the plan. But is it all over now? Or what else is happening?
No, well, as you alluded to earlier, we had an alleged Chinese spy ship sailing around the south of Australia,
Right.
Up through what's called the Great Australian Bight, which is, if you look at a map of Australia, there's this little indentation down the bottom. That's the Great Australian Bight. Now, once again, it was reported as a spy ship, but there was no proof of it. Did it have surveillance capabilities? Yeah, it probably did. But does that mean it's spying? And the one thing that was totally ignored was, of course, this ship just didn't pop up in Australian waters. It had actually spent almost 2 months in New Zealand waters conducting scientific research with scientists from, I've got to be careful, New Zealand, Brazil, India, China, Argentina, and a couple of European countries. So
there were 8 countries in all, I think.
So they were on a legitimate scientific mapping the ocean floor at depths which hadn't been mapped in New Zealand, even though it was in the Tasman Sea and just outside of New Zealand territorial waters. They hadn't seen, and with the New Zealand media was quite, or certainly in the New Zealand scientific community and the media reported it, were very complimentary of the cooperation and what went on. And I guess this is the point. You call it a Chinese spy ship, but hang on, it's crewed by all these scientists, not only from many countries that we're allied with or allied with. So once again, media hysteria. And then you had Tony Abbott, our former Prime Minister, appear on Sky News, I think in the first week in April. I mean, it was the first week in April. I think the 1st of April, might have been an April Fool's Day comment on his part, that it's a disgrace, and it said, and Australia should engage in tit for tat responses. We should be up there. And I'm thinking either he's being entirely disingenuous, or, and I wouldn't put this beyond the realms of possibility, this man was our opposition leader for 5 years. He was a senior minister in the previous Howard government for a similar amount of time, and he was prime minister for almost 2 years, and yet he seriously didn't know that we're constantly engaging in military exercises in around China's waters. It's quite possible he didn't know.
I find it very difficult to believe he wouldn't know about that. Even as a former prime minister, he would still get briefings. I know this for a fact because Paul Keating has mentioned it. He's had briefings on things like AUKUS and the like. So as a former prime minister, because he's speaking about these things, he would have been briefed. I don't think there's any question that he wouldn't know that even today, Australian military ships are sitting off the coast of China. They are, and they're doing that every single day. And they're flying these, I think they're Orions. They're flying,
correct,
literally spy planes. We talk about, you said this was an alleged spy ship, and these literally are spy planes. This is their purpose, is to spy. And they fly. And this is one of the things where when they fly towards Chinese airspace, China escalates. It does exactly what the flight rules regulations say they need to do. And it ends up with them dropping flares in front of the plane that's flying towards their secure space. So I don't think China can be, China gets accused of being wrong all the time, but I don't think they can be not proven to be wrong. They can be accused, because that's all it is allegations without any evidence.
Yeah, and look, and it's a narrative run by every nation that they're right, and anyone who opposes them, is wrong. And I guess the media picks up on it. And I guess the thing that annoys me about the West, we come up with these flowery terms as like-minded democracies, or upholding the world-based order. I mean,
freedom of navigation.
These are by and large inventions of the United States post the Second World War, and which which Western countries have fallen lockstep into line with. If you look at Professor Jeffrey Sachs, and I'm sure a number of your viewers would know who Jeffrey Sachs is. If you don't, Google him.
SACHS.
Yes. He's got some incredible insights into, he's a world-renowned economist, and who's worked right around the globe, particularly Europe. But one of the points Sachs makes is that privately, the head of government and head of state pronouncements of European countries is they're all 100% behind NATO and the US alliance. But privately, there's a great deal of concern and skepticism. But if we go back another few decades, and I'm paraphrasing here, Henry Kissinger, the great American statesman, if you can call him that, war criminal, if other people would have their way, for the bombing of Cambodia he instigated in the 1970s, a country America was not at war with, yet resulted in the deaths of more than 100,000 innocent civilians. Kissinger said, it's terrible to be an American enemy, or it's whatever the exact words were, but it's fatal to be a US ally.
And Australia is finding that out right now, I think.
Exactly. Australia's policies towards China are not driven by our fear of China. They're driven by our fear of the United States. Absolutely.
Yeah, John Lander, who has been a guest on my show a couple of times, former vice ambassador to China and ambassador to Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, has made the same comment. His biggest fear is not that America will have a war with China. And I agree with him 100% on this, but it was him that vocalized it, first of all, that I'm aware of. But his greatest fear is that Australia will be used as a proxy in America's war with China, basically in the way that Ukraine is being used right now. They do not want to go to war with China. There will just be too many body bags coming home. On both sides. I mean, it's not going to be very pleasant at all. I'm not saying China will win this or China will lose this. It's going to be nasty, and they would rather it was not America's war. So John's comment was quite valid, in my opinion.
I don't agree with that. I think the Taiwanese will be the proxy. Australia, history tells us Australia will never go into a war unless it's following in the coattails of US troops. So, and where would we fight? I mean, my concern in a conflict with if the United States was involved, and I think this is a hypothetical and a very unlikely thing, as Australia becomes a target, and Australia becomes a target, a military target of the Chinese, and a legitimate military target, because we have an air base in outside of Darwin called the Tyndall Air Base, which the Americans, it's an Air Force base, which have recently been involved in upgrades and are continually so, which can host up to 6 US B-52 bombers. Now, these bombers, which have freedom to land and move in and out of Australia as they like, are almost all nuclear armed. And the same thing near Perth in Western Australia. We have a naval base called HMAS Sterling, and that's been opened up to US nuclear powered, but also nuclear armed submarines. So and this has happened under the current government. So without any consultation with government, without any consultation with the Australian people, without any meaningful scrutiny by the Australian media, Australia is now, for all intents and purposes, a nuclear armed mid-level power. And it's outrageous that that we've joined a club which includes Russia, the United States, China, Israel, almost certainly Pakistan, India, France. And what's more, unlike these other countries, we haven't got our fingers on the nuclear button. We just host these nuclear weapons. And of course, we're going to become a legitimate target. But I think in terms of, I think America's recent wars, what it's learned is that it doesn't win these wars. It ends in disaster. And I think the consequences of a war with China and the almost certain loss of a war should America pursue it. And I think one of the other things, obviously, there's a very, very strong feeling in China's leadership now that reunification should be achieved sooner rather than later with Taiwan. How is that going to happen militarily? I mean, you're going to, from a practical level, what will the mothers of Chinese soldiers and most combat-age troops in China at this time come from one-child families? What will the mothers of China say when their sons cross the Taiwan Straits in order to kill or get killed by other Han Chinese? They're the same people.
And which is why nobody wants that. I disagree with you. I hope you're right on John Lander's comment. Honestly, I hope you're right. And I can see your logic behind that. But there's not a lot of logic, as we know, in terms of politics. But I've not seen any indication anywhere that China is comfortable with having a resuming the kinetic hot war or the hot civil war and taking Taiwan by force. I'm not seeing that at all. And I'm not seeing it from a high level. I'm not seeing it from low level. I'm not seeing it from reading Xi Jinping's books. It's just not mentioned. Whether it, what it might be going on behind closed doors, I don't know. But it's certainly not mentioned publicly. It is very, very much a, we'll take this when it happens. It's an inevitability that it will happen, and not through force, but perhaps through economic coercion.
Yeah,
perhaps.
I think so. Yeah, coercion or dangling the carrot or taking the stick. But I think, look, if one possible line of thinking of China's leadership may well be, and if it's not, it should be, is that whose interest does a war with China, I beg your pardon, a military conflict between mainland China and Taiwan, whose interest does that serve? The American interest. It's absolutely within the interest of the United States for China to have a war with Taiwan. So purely from that point of view, I mean, as you say, I mean, China as a nation and the Chinese people more broadly as a culture, they got to where they are by playing the long game, and so they're very good at playing the long game. And I think as desirable as it might be to reunify Taiwan with the mainland, if it's going to lead to problems or issues that play into the hands, or scenarios that play into the hands of its global adversaries, i.e. the United States, well, there's a disincentive to do anything that plays into America's hands.
True. So just a few weeks ago, let's touch on the Trump tariffs. We're not here to talk about trade, but touching on the Trump tariff thing. Trump put tariffs on Australia, America's probably not America's longest ally. That would probably be the UK, but certainly America's loyal ally for a long time. And Australia's only been a country for 125 years, 124 years. 1901, it became a country. And since then, it has supported America in every war that America has asked it to support. It was in Vietnam, it was in Korea, it is in everything. It's in Iraq, it's in Afghanistan. It's been there. They've been into Africa, the Middle East. Australian troops really do work very well with America. And now America's put a tariff on. So how has that changed, or has that changed Australian sentiment towards? Now, I'm thinking Australian sentiment towards America would definitely have changed, but has Australian sentiment, as a result of this, changed towards China?
Look, I've got a rather uncommon view that I don't think Donald Trump's is anywhere near insane or unhinged.
Right.
There's the public Trump who's quite adversarial and says things his support base wants to hear. Last week, John Daly, who's a comedian and has the Daily program. His name. Can I do a quick little?
Sure, look it up. I don't know the Australian comedians. Sorry.
No, he's American.
Oh, American comedian.
The Daily Show. John Stewart. I beg your pardon. Here we go.
Okay.
John Stewart, who has a sort of a very edgy comedic program, very centre-left, not pro-Democrat, but certainly leans far closer to the Democrats than he does the Republicans. He was invited to the White House to have a private dinner. He had a 2.5-hour dinner with Trump, Dana White, who's the UFC boss, a big Trump supporter, and a couple of other sort of minor sort of celebrity Trump supporters. There were 4 of them, but Stewart was the only one who was critical of Trump and certainly advocated along the way never to vote for Trump. And he came out of that, and he appeared back on his show, and he said the Donald Trump I met was a reasonable person. He listened. He didn't shut me down. I was critical of him. He didn't interject, and he said that this is a very smart, measured guy. The private Donald Trump is very easy to get on with.
Right.
Now, getting back to the public Donald Trump, who appears crazy, I think it was just a push, and Yanis Varoufakis, who's another great commentator, the former Greek finance minister, you can Google him, and hopefully you can rely on autocorrect if you can't spell Greek names like Varoufakis. I'm sure viewers will work it out.
Google Yanis and he'll come up.
Yeah.
He's very prolific. I actually watched a video of his last night. Interesting guy.
He was interviewed by TRT, the Turkish television network, last week, and he said it's not unhinged by Trump. It's a negotiating tactic. He thinks that he's going to push big German, French, Italian companies, Japanese companies to, rather than offshoring their production and onshoring them in America. So companies like Volkswagen and BMW should open up auto plants in America, and that will end the tariff war. Now, of course, late last week, Trump announced that he'd lifted the tariffs on mobile phones or cell phones, electronic devices and electronic components out of China, because it's just crippling the American industry. One of the projections were that if the United States had to manufacture iPhones in the US, they would retail for $3,000 or $3,500.
Yeah.
Now you can't compete. So I think it's just a negotiating point with Trump. He's pushed these things hard. He's put them on everyone so as not to show favorites. Australia actually has a trade surplus with the United States. We buy a lot more from them than they buy from us. So in and of itself, it shouldn't really harm us all that much. And Australia is too afraid of America to start whacking tariffs on.
The other thing is Australia's exports to America are less than 5% of its total exports, whereas exports to China are almost 40%. So in my opinion, we Australians, I am an Australian, we ought to be looking at China as our lifeline, not at America. If there's going to be world turmoil in trade, the one country that Australia doesn't want to upset isn't America. It's definitely Australia. It's definitely China, sorry. And I think that's the way they've got to look at it. But I'm wondering if there isn't something going on here where perhaps, and I'm not sure why, but perhaps America would prefer to see Dutton in power. Perhaps they'll throw a lifeline out to Dutton. If Dutton wins, we'll remove the tariffs. And that will make almost zero difference to Australia's trading position because it's such a small amount. But it might help Dutton over the line. I'm not sure why I think that, but
no, I don't agree. I think the America's leadership would be reasonably confident, no matter who's in power, that they would acquiesce to US interests, and
I think so too.
So I think would Dutton be a better option for the United States? I don't know. I mean, I would argue that certainly since the Vietnam War, Anthony Albanese's government, and particularly the Deputy Prime Minister, Richard Marles, who was our defense minister, Marles is one of the most hawkish, pro-American defense ministers I think we've ever had. And I think, and I'm being very facetious here, a little bit facetious, I think Niles is totally incapable of any independent thought process. He simply acts solely in what is or what he believes to be US interests. So I think, I mean, the one place in which they've navigated, into calmer waters is that the current Australian Labor government, the Albanese government, has not engaged in megaphone diplomacy with China. It hasn't made all these public pronouncements that it disagrees with China and China's doing the wrong thing. happening, and China's abusing human rights, and China's is usurping democracy, and China wants to snatch back Taiwan. They've been very muted in their response, but on the other hand, they've pulled us far, far closer to the United States. I mean, we've the AUKUS deal, which is the Australia, UK, US. It's not an alliance. It's a defence pact where basically Australia has agreed to spend $368 billion buying submarines from produced in the United States, but with British technology. I mean, it's the most absurd. It's the most ridiculous and worst deal in Australia's history, probably in anyone's history, because one of the key planks of this deal to buy, I think it's 6 or 8 nuclear-powered submarines, is the US doesn't actually have to deliver on them.
No.
The whole getting these submarines is contingent on their ability to make them, and as it stands now, the US cannot make enough submarines for its own need. So we're making Australia are making I think a $3 or $4 billion down payment on these submarines, billion Australian dollars. And that money is literally going straight into US shipyards in San Diego to retool them and build them up. So basically, what we're doing in the short term is subsidizing the production of US submarines against the backdrop of something, we may never get. But, this was an announcement under the previous government of Scott Morrison. It was an announcement made by Scott Morrison, then UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and we've had 2 or 3 since then. Then Joe Biden, who very famously in the video hookup news conference, said, "Thank you, Boris," and "Thank you," and he stumbled, and he couldn't remember the name of the Australian Prime Minister.
The Prime Minister down under.
Yeah, exactly. The man who was just about to pay him a few $100 billion in taxpayer money, he couldn't remember his name. Now all 3 leaders are gone, and not only are they gone, they left office with their reputations in tatters. I mean, Biden is an absolutely and utterly incompetent leader who couldn't let go. And effectively had to be forced out of office by his own party. Johnson, who was forced out among scandal or another, and Morrison in Australia,
pretty much disgraced too.
Exactly, who lost terribly and has done nothing other than diminish his already poor reputation. So that these are the guys that made an announcement, but the Albanese government's got in and they've pretty well from word go said, all right, we're going to buy these things. This is it, So, and he's just got into the guts of it, and he's committed, hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer money. And to give you an idea, once again, this is Australian dollars, but in terms of what it does to our government's ability to deliver services and infrastructure. And badly needed things to the Australian people. AUKUS is the equivalent of spending $1 million every day for the next 1,000 years. That's what we've committed to,
Right.
and our total government debt is around about $1 trillion Australian dollars. So we've committed 1/3 of government debt to buying submarines, which may or may not ever arrive. And they probably
may not be suitable for purpose either, because these are attack submarines, not defense submarines, which are only going to upset China even more. I think China's looking back and going, well, what's wrong with you? What is wrong with you? Just last week, or the week that Trump put the tariffs onto Australia, China's ambassador to Australia, I think Xiao Qiang is his name, and he made an overture towards the government and said, let's work together to overcome this. Now, I think that wasn't just to Australia. I think every ambassador in every country in the world has done the same thing. But it was immediately rejected by both the government and the opposition. Now, the interesting thing about this is because the opposition is fighting for they're both fighting for the election, and it does look like neither of them are going to come out clear winners. It's going to be a hung parliament. All of the polls say that. So I would have thought that something like this, okay, we will work with China. Now, you can use the usual caveats. We have problems with China, but we can work with them. That would be acceptable. But neither party, and even Defense Minister Richard Marles, because he was acting PM, got onto this and said, there's no way we're going to work with China. Now, given that China is more than a third of all of Australia's total imports and exports, was that a wise decision?
Politically, yeah, I think it was a wise.
Politically, it was wise. Okay.
You can't. Look, I think it was an opportunistic, announcement on the part of the ambassador. I think in the broader context and in the entirety, and if you look in going forward in Australia-China relations, it was a very reasonable proposition. I guess it was opportunistic insofar as the Trump administration was on the nose, and it's very easy to criticize Donald Trump. After he lost the 2020 election, I would say within a few months, if not a few weeks, of the Biden inauguration in January 2021, I realized, and I was telling everyone who I knew and listened to me, that Donald Trump would be the next president of the United States. Trump didn't stop campaigning. And if you look at the US, at the Republican primaries, the opening primaries, which I should remember, I think New Hampshire and the Iowa caucuses. He'd wiped his. There's primaries in 50 states, and in fact territories as well. Puerto Rico has a primaries as well, even though it's not a state. Trump wiped out all his opposition, but Donald Trump never stopped campaigning.
No, that's true.
And the guy's a brilliant campaigner. And then at the campaign rally, and in a nation of conspiracy theorists, and Trump, being one of them himself, it's amazing how there's been zero discussion on the attempted assassination of Donald Trump and where he. I mean, if you're the ultimate conspiracy theorist, it might have been a squib at a Hollywood type staged event with blanks, but Trump was unbelievable in that, because he got up with blood flowing out of his ear, and he pumped his fists into the air, and I can't remember the words he mouthed, but I thought
it was fight, fight, fight. But it sounded like I believe it was translated as fight, 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 which it did look like it was scripted, didn't it? Sure did.
And I thought, even in the midst of a massive security stuff up like that, because how could someone take a shot at, even if, don't forget, he not just a candidate, he was the former president, and it's the Secret Service's job to protect former presidents as well as serving presidents. He got up and he just made a moment of that, and he's just a brilliant campaigner. So he's very good at telling people what they want to hear. I mean, he showed up at the UFC fights over the weekend in the US, and he's a relentless campaigner. He makes these public pronouncements, and it doesn't matter what Trump says. He can change his mind, a day, a week, an hour later, and because he changes his mind so much. So I think, and getting back to Yanis Varoufakis, who said that this is not a Trump lunacy, it's Trump using tariffs as a bargaining tool. Whether it's a big bargaining tool with Australia, probably not. Whether Dutton can take advantage of it, I don't think so. It's a bit of a hot potato issue. I mean, Peter Dutton, who's the opposition leader, who's not all that different, certainly in his political conservatism and his views on things such as national security and immigration. Dutton quite disgracefully said, in an interview last year, that criticising immigration, that immigration should be curtailed because they were contributing to traffic jams in Sydney. Now, what an absurd thing to say, but what a mean-spirited thing to say. That blaming the traffic on immigrants and blaming the explosion in house prices on immigrants. I tweeted just the other day. Dutton appeared on the weekend with a young couple from Queensland who were struggling to buy their first home, and he expressed sympathy with them and disdain for the current Labor government because young people can't get into the housing market. Peter Dutton owns a massive portfolio of investment properties. He's bought and sold 26 investment properties over his lifetime. Now, and people who own investment properties, that they are the ones, in effect, who are pushing rents up, and they're the double-edged sword. One because they've created this market where there's very high levels of demand for very small, a relatively smaller pool of investment properties. So they're buying into these properties, and where the prices get pushed up is that they have. We have incredible tax incentives for people to buy investment properties. You can basically buy a property, and if you structure it that well, you can get a loan from the bank, and it costs you nothing. All you need is a 20% deposit in which to pay for the property. And once you've got into the property market, and if you structure it well enough, and the market is in a good phase, you really don't need a deposit on your subsequent properties because you use the equity you have in your first property to buy your second property. And of course, if the market goes soft, it all collapses like a house of cards. But these are the policies that are in place. As an individual, Peter Dutton's taken advantage of it. We have I think 300 members of federal parliament. Between them, they own 500 investment properties, so they're direct beneficiaries of these policies. And Dutton, a massive beneficiary. But what does he do? He runs around and he blames immigrants for these policies. And I think he's a very mean-spirited person. Malcolm Turnbull from the Liberal Party, certainly the most progressive Liberal Party Prime Minister we have, has on numerous occasions described Peter Dutton as a thug. Not bad from one of your own predecessors in your own party. So I don't think Dutton's got traction. There's no mood for change. And as you said, we're going to end up in a hung parliament, a minority government, which will rely on the support almost certainly of independent candidates. And it's looking very, very likely that it will be a minority Labor government. So the current government will be returned, they won't have an absolute majority. And they'll have to negotiate with independent candidates. And I think that's a good thing for Australia because the major parties over decades and decades have proved that they do not act in the interests of all Australians, only a very small number of Australians, which are essentially the rich supporters and the corporate supporters.
Yeah, very similar to the American system. I quite like China's methodology. The house prices crashed. There's no question about that. And it was difficult. It is difficult still. But what is available? There are thousands of rental places available. I actually know someone who owns hundreds of apartments, and he's never moved into one of them. He was collecting them. Every time he was doing contracting work, and every time he was doing contracting work on business developments, he got paid some cash, but mostly in property. And then, of course, he's just borrowing off against them to keep his business going. But I mean, he's a billionaire, and he's still a billionaire, but he's just lost a couple of billion. He's got more. It doesn't bother him. He'll eventually make his money back. It will happen. But for people like us, who we bought a new apartment at rock bottom price, great, but we couldn't sell the old apartment because we would have lost money. So it kind of balances out. Ultimately, this is a better system for the people looking for property to live in, as opposed to the speculators looking for property to invest in. So I do like what China has done there. we've gone well over the hour that I suggested that we might stop at. So
Yeah.
let's try wind this up, because there's something now. We're going to make a public announcement about what you're doing. You're actually, as I mentioned at the beginning, a brilliant photographer, and you're doing something. Tell me about that project, and I'll put the name of it up.
I'm working on a portrait photography project. Portraits are not something that I've done over the course of my life as a photographer, but there's two reasons I've come up with it. That certainly, and my market is Chinese women in Australia. Chinese women love having their photograph taken. Not all of them, but a lot of them do. If you just look at their WeChat and their social media, not all of them, but photographs are very staged. I went to a party on Saturday, and it was at the Crown Hotel, which is one of the big, one of the newer 5-star hotels in Sydney. And we went to the infinity pool there, and one of the girls there asked me to take photos of her, and she was posing and she was dressed up, and it wasn't too bad, because it wasn't a totally made up photo shoot, but it wasn't really her. It didn't capture the essence of who she is. And if you go to a studio photographer, now I'm going to be very critical of Chinese portrait photographers, because technically they're very good. I mean, they know how to light a shot. Not all of them, but a lot of them. They know how to light a shot. They know how to focus it. They know how to get the more or less a right depth of field. But they put too much makeup on the models. They put them in costumes. They put them in fake settings, and then they Photoshop the hell out of them. So a 40-year-old woman comes out looking like a 23-year-old cover model, and look at it and it's great, but it's not me. Whereas I like to capture the essence of my subject, hence the idea inner beauty. So it's photographing, and I'm sticking with the Chinese market, because of course I have many great connections in the Chinese community here, and that's I guess the unique selling point is that I want to capture the inner beauty. So a photograph that you look at people, or you look at a woman and say, yeah, she's confident, and she her what she has to offer is much more than a two-dimensional image, and from the point of view of the participants and the subjects, I want them and their friends to look at themselves and say, that's real. I was at a function a few months ago, and I haven't got any with me, but I've got little business cards with a portrait just on the back of the business cards, one of the portraits. And the girl I met was from Inner Mongolia. And I said, oh, I'm having lunch tomorrow with a friend from Inner Mongolia. I pulled out the card. I said, here she is. And she immediately said, oh, that's Journalistic. And I thought, great, she didn't have to hesitate for a moment. She knew who that was, and that's what I want. She said that.
Capture the person.
And so I want look at it, but I want people to know them, to look at it and go, right, that's her. It's a beautiful photo. It's in a lovely setting. So yeah, so that's the idea behind Inner Beauty. Once I collect, enough images, I'm looking at probably 8 or so. I've done 3 series of portraits to date. Then I hope to have an exhibition, and that's the idea. Make them feel special, rather than feeling special for a few minutes, really, after seeing a photograph of themselves, all made up like a cover model. I want to make an entire experience. So yes. That's the Inner Beauty project, and I'm very excited about it. And over the coming months, I'll pull it together and yeah, hopefully have not hopefully, we'll have a big launch gallery event, so that the ladies who participate in it will not. It won't. Will it
become a book, do you think?
No, because there'll be two. They'll just be too individualized. Maybe down the track, but possibly. As you know, I have a book which came out a couple of years ago called China Moments in Time, or Moments in Time, a journey across China. And China Moments in Time was the exhibition at which I launched it. And I'll probably do an expanded version of that in the next year or two.
Yeah.
I'm planning on some more trips to China. I engage in some more photography. And so once I've got a portfolio of more images, that's something I'll look at.
There's a very interesting. I've taken a look at your Inner Beauty website, and they are beautiful. They're not beautiful. Well, one of them is particularly beautiful, but you've captured something there. You've captured the spirit of the personality of the person, and I like that. And I like the testimonials that they've given as well, because they know that what you've done and how you've achieved it, and that's good. Yeah. Your book was fantastic. We did talk about that the last time we were on this channel together, and there is one picture, and people can go look at this as well. You can find this online. There is one picture in the book which is actually taken about 500 meters from where I live in Zhongshan. It's amazing. When I saw that picture, I know that place. I've cycled up that alleyway before, many times actually, because it's a shortcut that I sometimes take to avoid a set of traffic lights. And it's just behind Walking Street, our public pedestrian street. So it was, for me, that's been interesting. And I'm really looking forward to when you do come back to China and actually meeting you for the first time in person, having a coffee or a beer or something, and just sitting down and talking about your experiences. So anything you want to finish with just before we get going? Where can people find you and things like that?
I'm all over the place. You can find me on probably most regularly on johnmenadue.com.au. I should know. It's cached in my internet browser. I can never remember.
It's there. Yeah, it just comes up on mine too. johnmenadue.com. That is Pearls and Irritations.
And that's and I'm enjoying writing for that on a weekly basis. But I pop up there. My photography. I'm on Twitter, which is not as often as I used to be. I have a Chinese friend. After I met her a few years back, she said to me, she said, "I've looked at your Twitter account, your LinkedIn account, and your WeChat Moments. You're three completely different people."
I think Twitter, we are.
Said on Twitter, all you do is argue with people. Said on WeChat Moments, you're very nice and you celebrate how great life is, and on LinkedIn, you're totally serious.
All right. Well, I guess LinkedIn is supposed to be like that. So, Marcus, thank you very much once again, and everybody else who is in the chat there. We got a couple of good questions which I wound them into the conversation, and I think we've answered everything. But thank you very much once again for your take on what's going on. Good luck with all of your work with the Citizens Party. I know that you are good friends with Robbie. I'm also good friends with Robbie. I'm torn now because Cameron Leckie is standing in Queensland as well, and he's another good friend. So it would be, if I was in Queensland, my choice for Senate would be a difficult choice: Citizens Party or my friend Cameron. So I'm glad I'm not voting this time.
No, exactly. And I think this is one of the things that there's been a switch away, if I can finish on this, from the major parties in a lot of democracy, but certainly in Australia, which is it's good to see, because the major parties just work in unison on so many crucial issues where they should be delivering to the public, but they're not. But one of the things that Robbie's shown with the Australian Citizens Party, or the Citizens Party in and of itself, is that you can have influence on the public discourse. They contribute to a lot of Senate committees and Senate inquiries, and they do take up causes and really deliver results, and that's been and that's been fantastic. So I'm happy to work with them. I'm writing a few stories a week for them for their member newsletter. So and working on a bit of media stuff with them. So it's fantastic. I'm really enjoying it, and if I can participate to the wider public discourse in Australia, I'm delighted.
And keep thinking about China and Chinese people and how nice they are.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And on that happy note, let's let's end the stream and say goodbye.